Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something absolutely spectacular. The epic tale of how Mother Nature herself decided to personally end Hitler's dreams of world conquest with nothing more than a thermometer and an attitude problem. We're talking about Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, and how it got absolutely demolished by Russian winter like a tourist in flip-flops trying to climb Everest. So before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely fascinated by stories of epic military disasters and weather-related carnage. And definitely let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the temperature is like there right now. Given what we're about to discuss, I'm curious if any of you are brave enough to be watching this from somewhere actually cold. Now grab a warm blanket, maybe make some hot chocolate, and let's settle in for tonight's journey through one of history's most spectacular examples of what happens when human arrogance meets meteorological reality. So, you think you could have survived a Russian winter while simultaneously fighting the Red Army and dealing with equipment that stops working when it gets too cold? That's precious. Really, like thinking you could juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle through a blizzard. Tonight, we're going to explore how 3.5 million German soldiers learned the hard way that some enemies can't be shot, bombed, or negotiated with. Some enemies just kill you slowly, methodically, and without any consideration for your military training or national superiority. This is the story of how Russian winter became Hitler's worst enemy, and trust me, it's a masterclass in why you should always check the weather forecast before invading anyone, especially if that anyone happens to be Russia in 1941. Picture this, you're Adolf Hitler, and you've just conquered most of Europe. France, crushed. Poland, obliterated. Norway, check. Your ego is roughly the size of a small planet, and you're feeling pretty unstoppable. So naturally, you decide to do what every megalomaniac does when they're riding high. You pick a fight with the biggest, angriest bear in the forest. Russia. But here's the thing about bears, especially Russian ones, they don't just bite back. They wait for winter, and then they eat you alive while you're still wondering why your toes have turned black. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa begins. The name itself sounds impressive, doesn't it? Named after Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor who drowned in a river during the Third Crusade. Perhaps someone should have paid attention to that particular historical omen. But hindsight is 2020, and foresight was apparently in short supply at Nazi headquarters. 3.5 million German soldiers, the largest invasion force in human history, come rolling across the Soviet border like a mechanized tsunami. They've got tanks, artillery, aircraft, and most importantly, they've got confidence. Mountains of it. Enough confidence to choke a horse. They're the Wehrmacht, the finest military machine in the world, fresh off victories that made them look practically invincible. The plan was simple, beautifully simple in that way that only complete disasters can be. Strike fast, strike hard, crush the Red Army before winter sets in. 6 weeks, maybe 8 at the outside. How hard could it be? The Soviet military was a joke, wasn't it? Stalin had just finished purging his own officer corps, shooting anyone with half a brain or a hint of competence. The Red Army was led by yes-men and political appointees who knew more about party doctrine than military strategy. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Absolutely everything. But let's start at the beginning, when the German war machine was still purring like a well-oiled Panzer, and the soldiers were still optimistic about being home for Christmas. Summer in Russia isn't like winter in Russia. Summer is almost pleasant. If you can ignore the mosquitoes the size of small aircraft, and the fact that you're invading a country roughly the size of the moon. The initial assault was devastating. German forces punched through Soviet defenses like they were made of tissue paper. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. Cities fell. For a few glorious weeks, it looked like the plan might actually work. General Heinz Guderian's panzer groups were racing across the Russian steppes, covering distances that would make a NASCAR driver weep with envy. Leningrad was under siege, Moscow was within striking distance, and Stalin was apparently having something resembling a nervous breakdown, disappearing from public view for days at a time, probably wondering if this was how it all ended. The German soldiers were cocky, and why shouldn't they have been? They just pulled off the impossible. They were the masters of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had brought Europe to its knees. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Poland had lasted a month. Surely Russia, with its backward peasant army, would crumble even faster. But Russia is not France. Russia is not Poland. Russia is something else entirely. Russia is that friend who seems normal until you realize they keep a pet bear in their backyard and think hypothermia is a light seasoning for their morning vodka. The first hint that things might not go according to plan came in July. The German advance was slowing. Not stopping, mind you, just slowing. The distances were enormous. Supply lines stretched like rubber bands. The roads, if you could call them roads, were little more than mud tracks that turned into rivers when it rained and dust bowls when it didn't. German tanks, designed for the neat, paved roads of Western Europe, started breaking down, not from enemy fire, but from the simple mechanical stress of operating in conditions they were never designed for. Tracks snapped, engines overheated, transmissions failed. The vaunted German engineering was meeting its match in Russian geography. But the real enemy hadn't shown up yet. The real enemy was still months away, gathering strength, sharpening its claws, preparing to demonstrate exactly why Napoleon had turned around and gone home with his tail between his legs a century and a half earlier. August turned to September. The German advance continued, but it was like watching a marathon runner hit the wall. They were still moving, but each step was becoming more laboured, more costly. The Red Army wasn't collapsing as expected. Instead of surrendering in massive numbers, Soviet soldiers were fighting with a desperation and ferocity that caught the Germans completely off guard. This wasn't the orderly retreat and surrender they'd grown accustomed to in Western Europe. This was something primal, something that spoke to the Russian soul in ways that German military planners had never bothered to understand. The Russians weren't just defending territory, they were defending their existence. And when a Russian decides to defend something, they don't do it halfway. Soviet soldiers were digging in, fighting to the last bullet, and then fighting with bayonets. When they ran out of bayonets, they fought with entrenching tools. When they ran out of entrenching tools, they fought with rocks. This wasn't military tactics, this was pure, undiluted stubbornness elevated to an art form. The German soldiers, meanwhile, were starting to feel the first cold breath of autumn on their necks. September nights in Russia aren't like September nights in Germany. They bite, they have teeth, and they're just a preview of what's coming. But the Wehrmacht was still confident. Winter was still months away. Moscow was only a few hundred kilometers ahead. One more push, one final effort, and it would all be over. Victory was so close they could taste it, metallic and bitter like blood in the mouth after a hard punch. October arrived like an unwelcome relative at a family gathering. The temperatures dropped. Not drastically, not enough to cause real concern, but enough to remind everyone that time was running out. The German offensive toward Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon, began with renewed vigor. For a moment, it looked like it might work. Soviet defenses cracked. Panic spread through Moscow. Government offices were evacuated. Stalin himself apparently considered fleeing the capital. German reconnaissance units were getting close enough to see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. And then the weather changed. Not gradually, not with the gentle transition you might expect. One day it was autumn, brisk but manageable. The next day, it was as if someone had opened a door to hell, except hell had apparently frozen over and was now sharing its hospitality with anyone stupid enough to invade Russia in winter. The first snow fell in early November, just a light dusting, nothing too serious. The German soldiers looked at it and shrugged. They were tough, they were professionals. A little snow never hurt anybody. They had no idea what was coming. Russian winter doesn't announce itself with polite warnings. It doesn't send a formal invitation or give you time to prepare. Russian winter kicks down your door, eats your food, burns your furniture for warmth, and then makes itself comfortable in your living room while you freeze to death in your own house. The temperatures began dropping like a stone thrown off a cliff. -10 Celsius became -20. -20 became -30. And it kept falling, as if the thermometer was in free fall toward absolute zero. German soldiers, equipped for a summer campaign, suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that couldn't be shot, bombed, or negotiated with. Cold doesn't care about your military training. Cold doesn't respect your rank insignia. Cold is the ultimate egalitarian. It will kill a general just as efficiently as it will kill a private, and it will do so without any consideration for political ideology or national superiority. The first casualties weren't from bullets or artillery shells. They were from frostbite. German soldiers started waking up to find their fingers had turned black overnight. Toes went numb and stayed numb. Ears became chunks of frozen meat attached to the sides of their heads. Weapons began to malfunction. Gun oil froze solid, turning rifle bolts into immovable chunks of metal. Machine guns jammed after firing a few rounds. Tank engines refused to start, or if they did start, the metal became so brittle in the extreme cold that engine blocks cracked like eggs. But the real horror wasn't mechanical failure. The real horror was what the cold did to human beings. Imagine, if you can, trying to operate a rifle when you can't feel your fingers. Imagine trying to march 20 kilometers through snow that's knee deep when your boots have no insulation and your feet are solid blocks of ice. Imagine trying to dig a foxhole when the ground is frozen harder than concrete and your entrenching tool shatters on the first swing. Now imagine doing all of this while people are shooting at you. German soldiers began suffering from hypothermia in massive numbers. Not the gentle, sleepy hypothermia you see in movies, but the real thing, the kind that makes your brain stop working properly. That makes you want to strip off your clothes and lie down in the snow, because somehow, in your confused state, that seems like a good idea. Entire units began breaking down, not from enemy action, but from simple exposure. Men who had marched across Europe, who had conquered countries and earned medals for valor, were being defeated by weather. They were being killed by air temperature. The German supply system, stretched to the breaking point even in good weather, collapsed completely. Trains couldn't run because the tracks were frozen. Trucks broke down because their fuel lines froze solid. Horses, the backbone of German logistics, began dying by the thousands, their carcasses littering the roads like some macabre highway markers. Food became scarce, then non-existent. German soldiers started eating their leather belts, boiling them into a thin gruel that provided minimal nutrition, but at least gave their stomachs something to work on. They ate toothpaste for the calories. They ate candles. Some resorted to eating the glue from their own boots. And still, the temperature kept dropping. Russian soldiers, meanwhile, were dealing with the same weather, but they were dealing with it differently. They had winter clothing, real winter clothing designed by people who understood that Russian winter wasn't a season. It was a hostile alien environment that required specialized equipment to survive. Soviet troops had felt boots lined with real fur. They had quilted jackets that could keep a man warm at temperatures that would kill a German soldier in minutes. They had winter camouflage, white smocks that made them invisible against the snow. More importantly, they knew how to fight in winter. Russian soldiers had been dealing with cold weather their entire lives. They knew how to keep weapons functioning in sub-zero temperatures. They knew how to march through deep snow without exhausting themselves. They knew how to build shelters that would keep them alive through nights that would freeze German soldiers solid in their foxholes. The psychological effect of the winter was almost as devastating as the physical effects. German morale, which had been sky high during the summer months, plummeted faster than the temperature. Soldiers who had believed they were part of an invincible war machine suddenly found themselves wondering if they would live to see another sun rise. Letters home became increasingly desperate. Instead of writing about victories and conquered territory, German soldiers were writing about the cold. The unbearable, impossible soul-crushing cold that seemed to penetrate everything, that made every breath a struggle and every movement an exercise in pain. Some soldiers began to crack mentally. The combination of extreme cold, inadequate food, and the constant threat of death proved too much for minds that had already been pushed to their limits. Cases of combat fatigue, what we now call PTSD, skyrocketed. Men who had been perfectly functional soldiers became gibbering wrecks, unable to hold a rifle or follow basic orders. The German offensive ground to a halt, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer function as a military force. Tanks sat abandoned because they wouldn't start. Artillery pieces were left behind because the crews couldn't operate them with frozen hands. Entire divisions simply ceased to exist as effective fighting units. And then the Red Army counterattacked. Fresh Soviet divisions, equipped for winter warfare and rested from months of preparation, came pouring out of the forests like wolves sensing wounded prey. They moved easily through snow that trapped German soldiers up to their waists. They fought effectively in temperatures that rendered German weapons useless. They were everything the German army had been 6 months earlier confident, well-equipped, and absolutely merciless. The German retreat from Moscow began in December 1941. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal, it wasn't a strategic redeployment. It was a rout, plain and simple. German soldiers abandoned their equipment and ran for their lives, trying desperately to reach some kind of shelter before they froze to death on the open road. But there was no shelter. The Russian winter followed them, hunting them like a predator that never tired, never gave up, never showed mercy. German soldiers died by the thousands, not in glorious battle, but huddled in ditches, slowly freezing to death while their comrades walked past, too numb and exhausted to help. The retreat became a nightmare of epic proportions. Frostbite cases reached catastrophic levels. Entire regiments simply disappeared, absorbed into the white wasteland that Russia became in winter. Supply dumps were abandoned. Heavy equipment was left behind. The vaunted German war machine was dissolving like sugar in the rain. German field hospitals were overwhelmed with frostbite casualties. Doctors, working without proper heat or adequate medical supplies, were performing amputations with instruments so cold they stuck to their hands. Many patients died not from their injuries, but from hypothermia while waiting for treatment. The Wehrmacht's casualty reports from the winter of 1941-42 make for sobering reading. By some estimates, German forces suffered more casualties from cold, related injuries and illnesses than from enemy action. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective not by Soviet bullets, but by Soviet winter. Trench foot, a condition that had plagued armies for centuries, reached epidemic proportions. German soldiers, wearing boots that provided no insulation and no protection from moisture, found their feet literally rotting inside their footwear. The lucky ones lost a few toes. The unlucky ones lost entire feet. Equipment failures cascaded through the German ranks like dominoes falling. Radios stopped working when their batteries froze. Vehicles became metal sculptures when their engines seized up in the cold. Even basic items like pencils became useless when the graphite froze and became too brittle to write with. The German army had trained for many things, but they had not trained for this. They had not trained for combat at temperatures so low that human breath created ice crystals in the air. They had not trained for conditions where exposed skin would freeze solid in minutes, where metal was so cold it would stick to human flesh on contact. Individual acts of heroism became impossible when simply staying alive required every ounce of energy a person possessed. German soldiers found themselves in the surreal position of being more afraid of the weather than they were of enemy soldiers. The cold was everywhere, inescapable, relentless. It was inside their clothes, inside their shelters, inside their very bones. Sleep became a luxury that many could not afford. German soldiers learned that falling asleep in the extreme cold was often a death sentence. They organized watches not to look out for enemy soldiers, but to shake each other awake before hypothermia could claim another victim. Food, when it was available, often froze before it could be consumed. Bread became harder than wood. Soup turned into ice blocks. German soldiers were reduced to holding their rations inside their jackets, using their body heat to thaw their meals enough to eat them. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. Germany, the nation that had produced some of the finest scientists and engineers in the world, had been defeated by thermodynamics. All their advanced technology, all their tactical brilliance, all their military superiority meant nothing when the laws of physics decided to demonstrate exactly what happened to the human body at 40 degrees below zero. Russian partisans, meanwhile, were having a field day. Operating in their natural element, they could strike at German supply lines and then disappear into the forest, leaving no trace except dead German soldiers and burning trucks. The Germans, struggling just to survive, could barely mount effective patrols, let alone track down guerrilla fighters who knew the terrain intimately. The partisan war became particularly vicious during the winter months. Russian fighters, warm in their winter gear and familiar with the territory, would wait for German patrols to become strung out and vulnerable in the deep snow, then attack with devastating effectiveness. German soldiers, unable to maneuver effectively in the conditions, became sitting ducks. By January 1942, the Great German Offensive had become a Great German catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were casualties, not of war, but of weather. Equipment worth millions of Reichsmarks was scattered across the Russian landscape, abandoned by troops too frozen and exhausted to carry it. Hitler's reaction to this disaster was characteristically unhinged. Rather than acknowledging that perhaps invading Russia in summer, with no preparation for winter, had been a strategic error of cosmic proportions, he blamed his generals. He fired field commanders who had the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, advancing in sub-zero temperatures without winter clothing was not militarily sound. The Führer's solution to the winter problem was typically Hitler-esque in its complete disconnection from reality. He ordered his armies to hold their positions regardless of casualties, regardless of weather, regardless of basic human survival needs. German soldiers were told to dig in and fight to the death, even when digging was impossible, because the ground was frozen solid and death was coming not from enemy action, but from exposure. Some German units managed to establish defensive positions and wait out the worst of the winter, but they paid a horrific price. Surrounded by hostile forces and brutal weather, they became islands of misery in an ocean of white hell. Supply drops, when they came at all, often missed their targets or were immediately claimed by Soviet forces. The siege of Leningrad, meanwhile, had become a grueling test of endurance for both sides. German forces, originally confident they could starve the city into submission, found themselves engaged in a battle of attrition, where winter was killing more soldiers than enemy fire. The besiegers were becoming the besieged, trapped in positions they couldn't abandon and couldn't effectively defend. Soviet forces in Leningrad were suffering too, but they were suffering at home, defending their own city, surrounded by their own people. That made a difference psychologically. German soldiers were dying in a foreign land, thousands of kilometers from home, for reasons that were becoming increasingly unclear as the cold ate away at their will to fight. The siege became a symbol of the entire Russian campaign. What had been planned as a quick, decisive operation had turned into a grinding war of attrition, where victory would go not to the most skilled or best equipped army, but to whoever could endure the most punishment and keep fighting. Spring, when it finally arrived, brought little relief to German forces. The thaw created new problems, turning the Russian landscape into an ocean of mud that swallowed vehicles and made movement nearly impossible. The roads, such as they were, disappeared entirely under feet of viscous, boot-sucking muck that could trap a tank as effectively as quicksand. Russian mud, it turned out, was almost as formidable an enemy as Russian winter. German vehicles, already weakened by months of extreme cold, broke down in massive numbers when confronted with terrain that resembled a chocolate swamp. Supply lines, already stretched to the breaking point, snapped completely. The German army that emerged from its first Russian winter was not the same force that had confidently rolled across the Soviet border 11 months earlier. It was a shadow of its former self, weakened by casualties, demoralized by defeat, and haunted by the knowledge that they would have to face another Russian winter before the war was over. Equipment losses were staggering. Thousands of tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft had been abandoned or destroyed, not by enemy action, but by weather. The German war machine, which had seemed so invincible just a year earlier, had been stripped down to its bare bones by a few months of extreme temperature. More importantly, the myth of German military invincibility had been shattered. The Wehrmacht was not invincible. They could be defeated, and they had been defeated, not by superior tactics or better equipment, but by the simple fact that they had picked a fight with an enemy they didn't understand and couldn't defeat. The psychological impact of the winter disaster rippled through the German military hierarchy like shockwaves from an earthquake. Officers, who had built their careers on the legend of German tactical superiority, suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. The Russian front became known as the graveyard of the Wehrmacht, and for good reason. An entire generation of German soldiers learned what their predecessors should have taught them. That Russia in winter is not a place where civilized armies go to fight wars. It's a place where armies go to die, slowly and miserably, one frozen digit at a time. But the German High Command, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the solution to the winter problem was not better winter equipment or more realistic strategic goals. No, the solution was to try again, but harder this time, because if at first you don't succeed, freeze to death trying. The second winter of the Russian campaign, 1942-43, was in many ways even worse than the first. German forces, already weakened by a year of brutal fighting, were less prepared than ever to deal with extreme cold. Equipment was in short supply, morale was at rock bottom, and the Red Army was getting stronger and more confident with every passing month. The Battle of Stalingrad became the perfect symbol of German stubbornness in the face of impossible odds and hostile weather. Hitler's decision to fight for the city regardless of cost led to the encirclement of an entire German army. The Sixth Army found itself trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad as winter closed in around them like a vice. Supply drops to the encircled forces became increasingly desperate and futile. German transport aircraft, struggling to operate in weather that grounded most flights, could barely deliver a fraction of what the trapped army needed to survive. Soldiers were reduced to eating rats, leather, and anything else that might provide a few calories. The cold in Stalingrad was particularly vicious because the soldiers were trapped in the ruins of a city with no proper shelter and no way to retreat to better positions. They huddled in basements and bombed out buildings, burning furniture and debris for warmth, slowly starving and freezing to death while Soviet forces tightened their grip. German soldiers at Stalingrad wrote letters home that read like dispatches from hell. They described conditions that were almost beyond human comprehension, temperatures so low that rifle bolts froze shut, food rations so meager that men fought over scraps of mouldy bread, medical facilities so overwhelmed that wounded soldiers were left to freeze to death because there was no room in the makeshift hospitals. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, found himself in an impossible position. His forces were dying not just from enemy action, but from starvation and exposure. Every day his army got weaker, every day his situation became more hopeless, and every day Hitler's orders remained the same: hold position at all costs. The surrender at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked the beginning of the end for German ambitions in Russia. An entire army, nearly 300,000 men, had been destroyed. Most of the casualties were not from heroic last stands or glorious battles, but from the simple, brutal mathematics of human beings trying to survive in conditions that were fundamentally incompatible with human life. The survivors of Stalingrad, those few thousand German soldiers who lived to be marched off to Soviet prison camps, were walking skeletons. Months of inadequate food, extreme cold, and constant stress had reduced them to barely recognizable shadows of their former selves. The third winter, 1943-44, saw the German army in full retreat across a 1,000-mile front. The Red Army, now fully equipped with winter gear and experienced in cold weather operations, was pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Germany with increasing speed and ferocity. German defensive positions, hastily constructed and inadequately supplied, offered little protection from either Soviet attacks or Soviet weather. Soldiers manning these positions faced the same terrible choice that had confronted their predecessors: stay and freeze to death, or retreat and be shot for desertion. The retreat became a replay of Napoleon's withdrawal from Moscow, but with modern weapons and mechanized transport. German armies fell back through the same frozen landscape that had claimed so many of their comrades, leaving behind a trail of abandoned equipment and frozen corpses. Soviet pursuit was relentless. Red Army units, moving easily through snow and cold that still paralyzed German forces, struck at retreating columns with devastating effect. German soldiers, struggling to move through terrain that exhausted them within hours, found themselves constantly under attack from an enemy that seemed immune to weather conditions. The German army's retreat through Ukraine and Belarus during the winter of 1943-44 became known as one of the most complete military disasters in modern history. Entire divisions simply disintegrated, their soldiers scattered to the winds or dead in roadside ditches. Equipment was abandoned wholesale as troops focused on the single overriding priority, staying alive long enough to reach some kind of shelter. By the fourth winter, 1944-45, German forces in Russia had been reduced to isolated pockets of resistance, surrounded by hostile forces and hostile weather. The Great Wehrmacht, which had once seemed destined to conquer Europe, was now fighting for its very survival against an enemy that included not just the Red Army, but the Russian climate itself. The final German units in Russia surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer function as military organizations. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion had accomplished what superior Soviet tactics and equipment had struggled to achieve: the complete destruction of German military power in the East. In the end, Operation Barbarossa failed not because of any single tactical error or strategic miscalculation, though there were plenty of both. It failed because Adolf Hitler and his generals made the same fundamental mistake that had doomed conquerors for centuries. They underestimated Russia, and more specifically, they underestimated Russian winter. They planned for a summer war and got a 4-year nightmare. They prepared for a quick victory and found themselves locked in a death struggle with an enemy that couldn't be defeated by conventional military means. They expected to conquer Russia and instead discovered that Russia conquered them, one frozen corpse at a time. The German invasion of Russia became a textbook example of how weather and climate can determine the outcome of military campaigns. All the tactical brilliance, all the advanced technology, all the military superiority in the world meant nothing when confronted with temperatures that made normal military operations impossible. Russian winter didn't just defeat the German army, it destroyed it. The Wehrmacht that retreated from Russia in 1945 was not the same force that had confidently rolled across the border in 1941. It was a broken, demoralized shell of its former self, haunted by memories of comrades who had frozen to death in foreign fields and equipment that had failed when it was needed most. The lesson of Operation Barbarossa was simple and brutal. You don't invade Russia in winter. You don't fight a war of attrition with an enemy that is better equipped, better prepared, and more accustomed to the conditions than you are. And most importantly, you don't pick a fight with an opponent whose strongest ally is the weather itself. Hitler's great gamble in the East had failed, not because his enemies were stronger or smarter or braver than his soldiers, but because he had chosen to wage war against an enemy that no army in history had ever defeated: the Russian winter. And Russian winter, as 3 million German soldiers learned the hard way, doesn't negotiate, doesn't retreat, and doesn't show mercy. It simply kills everything in its path, efficiently and without discrimination, until spring arrives to reveal the carnage left behind. In the case of Operation Barbarossa, that carnage included the dreams of German world conquest, the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of young men who froze to death in a land so far from home that their families never even learned where they were buried. The German invasion of Russia had begun with visions of glory and conquest. It ended with the simple, stark realization that some enemies cannot be defeated by human will or military might. Sometimes, nature itself picks sides in human conflicts, and when it does, it tends to pick the side that knows how to survive 40 degrees below zero. In the frozen fields and forests of Russia, surrounded by the bodies of their comrades and the wreckage of their equipment, the survivors of Operation Barbarossa learned the hardest lesson of all: that hubris, no matter how well armed and well trained, is no match for the simple, implacable hostility of a Russian winter. The cold doesn't care about your ideology, your military training, or your national superiority. The cold only cares about killing you, and it's very, very good at its job. The stories that filtered back to Germany painted a picture that the Nazi propaganda machine worked overtime to suppress. Families received letters from their sons describing conditions that seemed impossible. Conditions that challenged everything they thought they knew about German military superiority. These weren't tales of heroic sacrifice or glorious battle. These were horror stories written in frozen ink by men who were slowly losing their minds to cold and despair. German mothers opened telegrams informing them that their sons had died of illness or accident, rather than enemy action. bureaucratic euphemisms that couldn't hide the simple truth their children had frozen to death in a foreign land, thousands of kilometers from home, for reasons that were becoming increasingly difficult to explain or justify. The home front began to crack under the strain of this reality. German civilians, fed a steady diet of propaganda about swift victory and military invincibility, struggled to understand how their seemingly unstoppable army could be defeated by weather. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the master race be mastered by something as simple as temperature? Back in Russia, the few German units that survived the multiple winters became something like Arctic veterans. Men who had learned through bitter experience how to fight and survive in conditions that would have killed their younger, more confident selves. They developed their own techniques, their own survival strategies, their own grim humor about the absurdity of their situation. These veteran units became known for their resourcefulness and their absolute ruthlessness when it came to survival. They stripped clothing from corpses, both enemy and friendly. They burned furniture, books, photographs, anything that would provide a moment's warmth. They learned to sleep in shifts, with some men staying awake to ensure their comrades didn't freeze to death in their sleep. They developed 1,000 small techniques for staying alive in the cold. They learned to keep spare socks inside their jackets, using body heat to dry them. They learned to eat snow only after melting it, because eating frozen snow would lower their body temperature dangerously. They learned to recognize the early signs of frostbite and hypothermia in themselves and their comrades. Most importantly, they learned to fear the weather more than they feared the enemy. Soviet soldiers could be fought, could be defeated, could be negotiated with or avoided. Winter was implacable, unstoppable, absolutely without mercy or compromise. Winter killed everything it touched, given enough time and cold enough temperatures. These surviving veterans told stories that would have been unbelievable if they hadn't been witnessed by so many people. Stories of German soldiers who had wandered off into the snow during night watches and been found in the morning, frozen solid in standing positions, their rifles still in their hands. Stories of entire guard posts that had been discovered silent and still, their occupants dead at their posts, apparently having frozen to death so gradually that they never even realized what was happening. They told stories of weapons that had literally shattered from the cold, metal so brittle that rifle barrels snapped like icicles when fired. They told stories of vehicles that had been abandoned not because they were damaged by enemy fire, but because the fuel had frozen solid in their tanks, turning gasoline into a substance with the consistency of molasses. The psychological toll of these experiences created a generation of German veterans who never fully recovered from their Russian ordeal. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as severe PTSD, though such terms didn't exist at the time. They had nightmares about cold that would wake them in sweats. Even in warm weather, they hoarded warm clothing compulsively. Some could never again tolerate cold weather of any kind, becoming physically ill at the first sign of winter. The impact on German military doctrine was profound and lasting. Never again would German forces launch a major offensive without extensive preparation for winter conditions. Never again would German planners assume that weather was a minor factor in military operations. The Russian campaign had taught them, in the most brutal way possible, that climate could be as decisive as tactics, equipment, or numerical superiority. But by the time these lessons were learned, it was far too late to matter. The German war machine had been broken on the anvil of Russian winter, and no amount of tactical adjustment or strategic revision could repair the damage that had been done. The Wehrmacht's reputation for invincibility lay buried under the snows of Russia, along with hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had learned too late that some enemies cannot be defeated by human will alone. The final irony of Operation Barbarossa was that it succeeded in creating exactly the opposite of what Hitler had intended. Instead of providing Germany with Lebensraum and destroying the Soviet Union, the invasion had strengthened Soviet resolve, demonstrated German vulnerability, and ultimately contributed to the destruction of the Nazi regime itself. The Red Army that emerged from the crucible of the Great Patriotic War was hardened, experienced, and absolutely convinced of its own superiority. Soviet soldiers who had survived the German onslaught, and the brutal winters that followed became the backbone of an army that would eventually march all the way to Berlin, carrying with them memories of frozen German corpses littering the Russian landscape. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder that consumed German manpower at an unsustainable rate. Every winter claimed tens of thousands of soldiers, not to enemy action, but to simple exposure. Every spring revealed the full extent of the previous winter's carnage. Fields littered with equipment, and bodies that the spring thaw would slowly reveal, like archaeological evidence of a civilization that had tried to conquer nature and failed spectacularly. German logistics never recovered from the strain of trying to supply armies across the vast expanses of Russia during winter months. The transportation network, already pushed beyond its limits by the enormous distances involved, collapsed completely when confronted with the additional challenges posed by extreme cold. Railways became useless when tracks contracted and split. Roads disappeared under snow that wouldn't melt for months. The economic cost of the Russian campaign became astronomical when winter losses were factored in. Germany was not just losing soldiers, it was losing enormous quantities of expensive equipment that simply couldn't function in Russian winter conditions. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, artillery pieces, communications equipment, all of it designed for the temperate climate of Central Europe. All of it useless when temperatures dropped below the tolerances of German engineering. German industry, already strained by the demands of fighting a multi-front war, couldn't keep up with the rate at which equipment was being lost to weather damage and abandonment. Factories worked around the clock to produce replacement vehicles and weapons, only to see them disappear into the white void of Russian winter, never to return. The human cost was even more staggering. German casualty figures from the Eastern Front read like the population statistics of small countries. Entire age cohorts of German men simply disappeared into Russia, leaving behind widows, orphans, and empty villages. The demographic impact on Germany would be felt for generations. An entire generation of potential fathers, workers, and leaders frozen to death in foreign fields. The propaganda efforts to explain these losses became increasingly desperate and unconvincing. German news reports spoke of strategic withdrawals and tactical adjustments, but couldn't explain why these withdrawals always seemed to coincide with the arrival of winter, or why German forces seemed to perform so much better when the weather was warm. Goebbels and his propaganda machine tried to spin the Russian campaign as a heroic struggle against overwhelming odds, but the reality was too stark to be hidden by clever rhetoric. German soldiers weren't dying heroic deaths in glorious battle. They were dying miserable deaths from exposure, starvation, and disease. There was nothing glorious about freezing to death in a foxhole. Nothing heroic about losing your toes to frostbite while retreating through knee-deep snow. The letters home became increasingly desperate and increasingly censored. German military censors worked overtime to remove references to the cold, to the inadequate equipment, to the growing sense that the war in Russia was unwinnable. But the truth had a way of seeping through despite their best efforts, carried in the hollow eyes of soldiers on leave, and the growing lists of the dead and missing. By 1944, the German public was beginning to understand the true cost of Operation Barbarossa. The confident predictions of swift victory had given way to grim acknowledgements of a prolonged struggle. The maps in German newspapers, which had once shown arrows pointing deep into Soviet territory, now showed defensive positions and shortened front lines. The winter of 1944-45 saw the final collapse of German resistance in the east. Soviet forces, now fully equipped and experienced in winter warfare, pushed the remnants of the Wehrmacht back across Eastern Europe in a series of offensives that succeeded precisely because they were launched during the months when German forces were least able to resist effectively. The Red Army had learned to use winter as a weapon, timing their attacks to coincide with periods of extreme cold when German resistance would be weakened by exposure and equipment failures. Soviet commanders, who had once feared German tactical superiority, now looked forward to winter campaigns. Knowing that the weather would be fighting on their side, German defensive positions, hastily constructed and inadequately heated, became death traps for their occupants. Soldiers manning these positions faced the choice between staying at their posts and freezing to death, or abandoning their positions and being shot for desertion. Many chose a third option, surrendering to Soviet forces, who at least offered the possibility of survival in a heated prisoner of war camp. The final German forces in Russia surrendered, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they were too frozen and exhausted to continue fighting. The Great Wehrmacht, which had once terrorized Europe with its efficiency and ruthlessness, ended its Russian adventure as a collection of half-frozen scarecrows begging for mercy from the very people they had invaded. And that, in the end, is how German dreams of conquering Russia died, not in a blaze of glory or a final desperate battle, but slowly, quietly, and very, very coldly, in the endless white expanse of a Russian winter that had claimed conquerors before and would claim conquerors again. The cold had won, as it always won in Russia, patient and implacable and absolutely without mercy, killing everything in its path until spring arrived to reveal the full extent of its victory. World without end. Amen.